I stopped to help a little boy find his mother in a crowded park. After their tearful reunion, the mother handed me a note that made my hands shake. I asked her what it meant. She just pointed to her son and said, "Can't you see it?" I looked closer at the boy's face and I froze. The truth was unthinkable, and 30 minutes later, police were at my parents' door. This is a story about a family secret that was hidden in plain sight. Before we get into it, I'd love to know, what city are you watching from today? And be sure to subscribe for our daily stories. Okay, let's head to that crowded festival. The feeling of being an outsider in my own family was not a loud, dramatic thing. It was a quiet, constant, and low-grade hum of wrongness that had been the background music to my entire life. I loved my parents, Richard and Susan, and I knew, in my own way, that they loved me. But our love was a polite, well-mannered affection, not the messy, unconditional, and deeply intuitive bond I saw in other families. It was in the small, unspoken details. They were both tall, with fair skin and light gray eyes. I was of average height, with an olive complexion and eyes so dark they were almost black. They were quiet, reserved, and analytical. I was passionate, a little chaotic, and deeply emotional. I was a guest in their house who had simply overstayed her welcome by about 25 years. They had told me I was adopted when I was young. It was a happy story, they said, a story of a young, brave girl who had given me to them, a loving, childless couple, so I could have a better life. It was a story I had always accepted. But as I had gotten older, the unanswered questions, the missing pieces of my own identity had begun to feel like a phantom limb, an ache for a person I had never known, my birth mother. 2 months ago, I had finally gathered the courage to begin the search for her, a quiet, secret quest I had kept from my parents, not wanting to hurt their feelings. On the day my life was cleaved in two, I was at the city's annual summer street festival, a loud, joyful, and chaotic sea of humanity. I was trying to escape the quiet, oppressive silence of my own unanswered questions. It was in the middle of that crowd that I found him. He was a little boy, no older than 6, standing frozen in the middle of the flowing river of people, his face a crumpled, tear-streaked mask of pure, abject terror. He was lost. My heart, a thing I had been trying to guard, simply broke for him. I knelt down in front of him, creating a small, quiet island in the middle of the chaos. "Hey there," I said softly. "Are you lost? What's your name?" "Sam," he whispered, his small body trembling. "I can't find my mommy." For the next hour, my own problems, my own search, my own sense of being lost completely disappeared. My only mission was this little boy. We held hands tightly, a silent pact against the overwhelming crowd, and we began our own search. We went to the festival's security tent. We described his mother. We waited. The reunion, when it happened, was a thing of pure cinematic beauty. A woman burst into the tent, her own face a mirror of the terror I had seen on her son's. "Sam!" she cried, and the little boy let go of my hand and ran into her arms, the two of them collapsing into a tearful, grateful, and loving embrace. I stood back, a happy, anonymous bystander, ready to slip away and let them have their moment. But as the mother, a woman named Laura, stood up, her son clutched to her, she looked at me, and her expression, which had been one of pure maternal relief, changed. She stared at me, her eyes a familiar, startling shade of dark brown, widening with a strange, intense, and deeply unsettling look of recognition. "Thank you," she said. Her voice had choked emotional whisper, though she was looking at me as if I were a ghost. "Thank you so, so much." "Of course," I said, a little flustered by the intensity of her gaze. "I'm so glad he's safe." As I turned to leave, she rushed forward and grabbed my arm. "Wait," she said, her voice a desperate, pleading thing. She fumbled in her purse, pulled out a pen, and scribbled something on a crumpled napkin. She pressed it into my hand, her own hand trembling. "Please," she whispered, her eyes full of a universe of unspoken words. "Please, just read this." And then she was gone. disappearing back into the crowd with her son. I stood there, my heart pounding with a new, strange, and inexplicable feeling. I looked down at the crumpled napkin in my hand. I thought it would be a phone number, an offer to buy me a coffee as a thank you. But it was not. It was a question. A strange, impossible, and life-altering question. And as I read the words, the entire fragile foundation of my own life, of my own identity, began to crack. I stood there in the dwindling afternoon crowd of the festival, the crumpled napkin a strange, warm weight in my hand. The woman, Laura, and her son, Sam, were a few yards away, watching me, her face a mask of pleading, terrified hope. I unfolded the napkin. The handwriting was a rushed, desperate scrawl, but the words were perfectly, terribly clear. It was not a question. It was a statement. You have a birthmark, shaped like a tiny, pale star on your left shoulder. I know this because I am the one who kissed it every night for the first 2 years of your life. My name is Laura, and I am your mother. The world went silent. The cheerful, boisterous sounds of the festival, the music, the laughter, the distant shouting of vendors, all of it just faded away into a dull roaring in my ears. My mind, a rational, orderly thing, refused to process the words. It was a prank, a cruel, insane joke, a case of mistaken identity. It could not be real. And yet, my hand, as if with a will of its own, moved to the collar of my own shirt. I pulled it aside, my fingers fumbling, my heart hammering against my ribs. And there, on the skin of my left shoulder, a place I had seen 1,000 times in the mirror, was the small, pale, and unmistakable shape of a tiny star. I looked up from the napkin, my eyes finding Laura's across the space that now separated us. I walked towards her, my legs unsteady, the world a dizzying, tilting blur. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice a ragged, broken thing as I held out the napkin, the proof of an impossible truth. "This has to be some kind of a mistake. My mother is Susan. My father is Richard. I was adopted." Laura's face, which had been so full of a desperate hope, now crumpled with a fresh wave of grief. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "No, my love," she sobbed, reaching out and grabbing my arm, her touch both a plea and a confirmation. "It's not a mistake. Oh, God, after all these years. Can't you see it?" "See what?" I cried, my own mind a screaming chaos of confusion and a dawning, terrible horror. "Look at him," she pleaded, her voice a raw, broken thing, as she pulled her small son, Sam, in front of her. "Look closer. Don't look at his hair. Look at his eyes. Look at the shape of his face."
And I did. I looked, for the first time, not at a lost little boy, but at the evidence. I looked past the different hair color and I saw it. We had the same dark, almond-shaped eyes, the same small, straight nose, the same stubborn, determined chin. It was like looking at a ghost, at a memory of my own childhood face staring back at me. I froze, the last of my denial shattering into a million irreparable pieces. "You weren't adopted, my love," Laura whispered, the words of final, devastating blow. "You were taken." She led me, a stunned, stumbling automaton, to a quiet, secluded bench, away from the last of the festival crowd. And she told me the story, the real story of my life. She told me about a day, 23 years ago, in a park very much like this one. She had been a young, single mother, and I had been her 2-year-old daughter, a little girl with a star-shaped birthmark on her shoulder. She had turned her back for a single terrible moment, a single life-altering second, and when she had turned back, I was gone. She told me of the 2 decades that followed, the police investigations that went cold, the private investigators who found nothing, the years of false leads, of dashed hopes, of a grief so profound it had hollowed her out. She told me she had never, ever, for a single day, given up hope of finding me. She had a new life now, a new husband, a new son, but the hole in her heart, the one that was shaped exactly like me, had never healed. I sat there on that park bench, a stranger between the mother I had just found and the brother I never knew I had. My entire life, my quiet, polite, and emotionally distant family, the feeling of never quite belonging, it was all a lie, a monstrous 23-year-old lie. They were not my parents. They were my kidnappers. Laura looked at me, her eyes, my eyes, full of 23 years of pain and a fragile new hope. "What do we do now?" she whispered. I looked at her, at my real mother. I looked at my own shaking hands, and I knew there was only one thing to do. I took out my phone. It was time to go home. It was time to confront the people who had stolen my life. I sat on that park bench, a stranger between the mother I had just found and the brother I never knew I had. My entire life, my quiet, polite, and emotionally distant family, the feeling of never quite belonging, it was all a lie, a monstrous 23-year-old lie. They were not my parents. They were my kidnappers. My real mother, Laura, sat beside me, her body trembling with a mixture of 23 years of pent-up grief and a new, terrifying, and fragile hope. "What do we do now?" she whispered, her eyes, my eyes, searching my face for an answer I did not have. For a moment I was paralyzed. My mind was a war zone of conflicting emotions. There was a cold, hard rage at Richard and Susan for the life they had stolen from me, from us. But there was also a strange, confusing, and deeply buried sense of love. They had raised me. They had tucked me in at night. They had read me bedtime stories. How could a person who had done those things also be a monster? But then I looked at my new little brother, Sam, who was now leaning tiredly against his mother, his own small face a picture of confusion. And I looked at Laura, at the decades of pain etched into the lines around her eyes. And I knew that my own confused feelings did not matter. The only thing that mattered was the truth. "I know who to call," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I took out my phone. The call was to a man whose name Laura had mentioned in her story, a name that had been a constant in her long, hopeless search. Detective Miller, a cold case detective who had never, ever given up on her daughter's case, even after it had been officially closed for over a decade. I explained, in a shaky, halting voice, who I was, where I was, and the impossible story that had just unfolded at a crowded street festival. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line, and then the detective's voice, full of a sudden, sharp, and intensely professional energy, came back. "Stay right where you are," he commanded. "Do not go back to the house alone. I am on my way." The journey back to the quiet suburban street I had always called home was the most surreal of my life. I rode in the back of Laura's car, my new little brother asleep beside me, his head resting on my shoulder. We met Detective Miller and 2 other plainclothes officers at the corner of my street. The plan they laid out was simple, and it made my blood run cold. They needed a confession. They needed Richard and Susan to admit what they had done, and they needed it on tape. And I was the only one who could get it. I was the bait. They fitted me with a small, discreet wire, the microphone hidden in the collar of my shirt. "Just get them to talk about the day they adopted you," Detective Miller instructed, his voice a low, calm rumble. "Get them to admit they were in that park. We will be listening to every word. We will be right outside. You will not be in any danger." I stood at the end of the familiar tree-lined street, the street I had ridden my bike down 1,000 times, and I looked at the house at the end of it. It was not my home anymore. It was the destination of my final, most terrifying mission. I walked up the familiar stone pathway, each step an eternity. The wind chimes my mother, Susan, so loved were tinkling softly on the porch, a sound that had always meant safety, a sound that now felt like a funeral bell. I took a deep, shuddering breath, and I knocked on the door. Susan opened it, her face breaking into a warm, familiar, and completely false smile when she saw me. "Thea, honey, you're home," she said, her voice full of the same polite but emotionally distant affection she had shown me my entire life. We were getting worried. How was the festival? I looked at her, at the woman who had stolen me from my own mother, at the woman who had raised me in a cage of lies, and I said the words the detective had told me to say, the words that would begin the end of her world. "Hi, Mom," I began, my voice a strange, calm and steady instrument that I did not recognize as my own. The festival was interesting. "We need to talk." I stepped over the threshold into the house I had called home for my entire life, and the familiar scent of lemon polish and my mother's, Susan's, potpourri filled the air. It was the scent of my childhood, a scent that now felt like a lie. My heart was a frantic, wild bird in my chest, the small, cold weight of the police fire a strange and terrible secret against my skin. "You met someone?" Susan asked, her voice full of a polite, maternal curiosity as she closed the door behind me. "Honey, that's wonderful. Was it a young man?" "No, Mom," I said, my voice a marvel of calm control that I did not feel. "Not a man." My father, Richard, looked up from the newspaper he was reading in his favorite armchair in the living room. "Thea, you're home," he said with a warm, easy smile. "Everything okay?" I walked into the living room, and to the very center of their quiet, comfortable, and stolen life. They were both looking at me now, their expressions open and unsuspecting. They were my parents. They had raised me. They had fed me. They had loved me in their own quiet and deeply flawed way, and I was about to destroy them. "I met a woman today," I began, my voice steady, reciting the script the detective and I had so carefully rehearsed. "And her little boy. A sweet little boy named Sam. He got lost at the festival and I helped him find her." "Oh, that's so like you, dear," Susan said, her face a mask of maternal pride. "You always had such a big heart." "She was a very nice woman," I continued, my own heart a cold, hard stone. "Her name was Laura, and she told me the most incredible and the most tragic story. She told me that 23 years ago, her own daughter, a little girl who was just 2 years old, was taken from her, kidnapped, from a park not far from here." I watched their faces. I saw the first faint flicker of something in their eyes, a shadow, a brief, almost imperceptible tightening around their mouths, but their expressions remained ones of polite, sympathetic interest. "How awful," my father said, folding his newspaper. "Did they ever find the person who did it?" "No," I said, my gaze now fixed on him, on the man I had called Dad. "They never did. The little girl was never found. Her mother, Laura, she told me she has spent the last 23 years looking for her." The room was silent now, the air thick and heavy with the unspoken truth that was beginning to close in on them. They were no longer relaxed. They were two animals sensing the first faint and unfamiliar scent of a predator on the wind. "That's a terrible story, Thea," Susan said, her face now a little strained. "But I don't see what it has to do with you, dear." "She told me something else," I said, my voice now dropping to a low, quiet, and dangerous whisper. I was going in for the kill. "She told me that her daughter, the little girl who was taken all those years ago, she had a birthmark." I paused, letting the word hang in the air. "A small, pale, and very unique star-shaped birthmark, right here, I said, and I slowly, deliberately reached up and touched my own left shoulder, just like mine. The silence that followed was a profound and terrible thing. It was the silence of a lie that has finally run out of room to hide. I watched as my mother's, as Susan's face, which had been a mask of polite concern, completely and totally crumbled. I watched as her hand flew to her mouth, a small, strangled sob escaping her lips. I watched as my father, Richard, his own face now a pale ashen gray, shot to his feet. "Susan, be quiet!" he hissed, his voice a low, panicked growl of a man trying to plug a hole in a dam that was already bursting. "Don't say another word." He then turned on me, his eyes full of a new, wild, and desperate fury. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You met some crazy, hysterical woman who told you a story and you believed her? We are your parents. We raised you. We loved you." "Did you?" I asked, my own voice now a whisper. "Did you love me, or did you just love the secret you had kept for so long?" "We gave you a good life," he shouted, his voice now cracking with the strain of his own lies. "A better life than she ever could have. We saw you that day in that park. You were all alone. Your mother was nowhere to be seen. We knew you were meant to be ours. It was fate."
And there it was, the confession. The ugly, pathetic, and self-serving truth, spoken aloud and captured, I knew, by the small, silent wire I wore against my own skin. He seemed to realize in that moment what he had just done. The furious, defensive anger drained out of him, replaced by a new, dawning, and absolute terror. He looked at me, at my calm, sad face, and he finally, truly understood. This was not a family argument. This was an interrogation. And just as that terrible, silent understanding settled over the room, the front door of the house, the door I had left unlocked, burst open. Detective Miller was the first one through, followed by a team of uniformed officers, their movements swift, professional, and absolute. The living room, my childhood living room, was suddenly a chaotic, swirling storm of blue uniforms and flashing lights. I stood in the middle of it all, a quiet, still point in the hurricane. I watched as my mother, Susan, collapsed into a weeping, hysterical heap on the floor. I watched as my father, Richard, a man I had once thought was so powerful, just stood there, his hands raised in a gesture of pathetic, absolute surrender. I looked at the weeping, broken people who had raised me, the people who had stolen me, and I felt nothing but a vast, empty, and profound pity. And then I looked past them to the figure standing in the now open doorway. It was my real mother, Laura, her own face a beautiful, tragic, and tear-streaked ruin. Our eyes met across the chaotic room. My old life was over, destroyed in a storm of sirens and a lifetime of lies. The days that followed were a blur of police stations, psychologists, and lawyers. The story was a firestorm, of course, the miracle of the lost daughter, the papers called it. But my own heart was a battlefield of conflicting emotions. There was a profound, righteous anger at Richard and Susan for the life they had stolen from me, for the lie they had forced upon me. But there was something else, too, something I was ashamed to admit, even to myself. When I closed my eyes, I didn't just see the faces of my kidnappers. I saw the face of the woman who had bandaged my scraped knees, the man who had taught me how to ride a bike. I remembered the warmth of their hugs, the sound of their laughter. They were monsters, yes, but for 23 years, they had also been my parents, and a part of me, a small, confused, and deeply wounded part, still loved them.
The turning point came a week later in a sterile conference room at the district attorney's office. Laura, my mother, was there, a fierce and protective lioness demanding the harshest possible sentence. "They stole my daughter's life," she told the DA, her voice shaking with a rage that had been simmering for 2 decades. "They deserve to spend the rest of their lives in prison." The DA nodded gravely and then turned to me. "With your testimony, Thea, that is almost certainly what will happen. A jury will see them as nothing but monsters. We just need your full cooperation." And in that moment, I was faced with a choice. I could have my vengeance. I could ensure that the people who had hurt me so profoundly would be locked away forever, erased from my life just as they had erased me from my mother's. It was what they deserved. It was justice. But as I looked at my real mother's face, a face so full of a righteous and justified anger, I realized something. More anger, more punishment, more years of loss, it wouldn't heal anything. It would just create another empty space, another generation of pain. "No," I said, my voice quiet but clear in the silent room.
Laura stared at me, her face a mask of shocked disbelief. "What? Thea, what are you saying?" "What they did was a monstrous, unforgivable crime," I said, my eyes meeting my mother's. "They stole me from you. They stole my entire history. And for that, they must be held accountable." I took a deep breath. "But they also raised me. They loved me, in their own broken and deeply selfish way. And sending them to a prison to die, it doesn't feel like justice. It just feels like more breaking." I turned to the district attorney. "Is there another way?" I asked. "A plea bargain? A sentence that acknowledges the crime but also acknowledges the complexity of a human life?" The resolution was not a simple victory. It was a messy, painful, and deeply complicated compromise. My parents, Richard and Susan, pled guilty. They did not get the life sentences Laura had wanted. They received a much shorter sentence with a requirement for years of intensive psychological therapy. The story ends a year later. I am in a small, sunlit apartment. It is my own. I am building a new life, a real one, piece by piece. My relationship with my real mother, Laura, and my new brother, Sam, is a slow, awkward, but beautiful process of discovery. And once a month, I do something I never thought I would. I go to a low-security prison, and I sit in a visitation room, and I talk to the 2 people who, at the same time, gave and stole my life. We do not talk about the past. We talk about the future, theirs and mine. It is not forgiveness, not yet. But it is, for the first time in all our lives, the truth. And in that truth, however painful, there is finally a chance for peace. An unbelievably powerful and complex story about a devastating secret and the difficult, compassionate path to healing. What a testament to the protagonist's strength and empathy. This story has an incredibly mature and difficult ending. What do you think of Thea's final decision to show compassion to her kidnappers? Could you have done the same? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this profound family drama, please show your support by hitting that like button and be sure to subscribe for more thought-provoking and emotional stories. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.